So, welcome to The Weight of Coaching, the show where we dig into the systems, strategies, and science behind high performance coaching and strength and conditioning. I'm your host, Jordan Browne, head coach at Method Barbell. On each episode, we'll talk with coaches, researchers, and practitioners who are building better athletes through clear methods and smart programming. Today's guest is Rob Ronan, a coach who built a classification system that's changing the way he delivers programming. Let's get to it. So, Rob, can you kind of go into how you got into coaching, your background,
Sure.
and getting into two locations?
Yeah. Rob Ronan, coach extraordinaire. I'm a national coach with USA Weightlifting. I've been in the sport as a coach for about 10 years. Austin Barbell, my company, the business has been around for about 9 or so. It's been a lot has changed in the world since we started. So if you go back 10 years, think about where you were. We were basically just getting started with with technology in any sort of S&C or weightlifting. So two businesses. Where do I begin? So with Olympic weightlifting, or with Austin Barbell rather, we started in a CrossFit gym, which I think is very humble beginnings for most coaches. I think that's a great place to be. You've got a feeder system of athletes that can come into your training. You've got different opinions. You've got a lot of bad technique or form. And then, with that, we just grew over time in that CrossFit gym. And unfortunately, that CrossFit facility, our business is a bit stronger than theirs at the time. And, we basically left there about after a year or so. And this is going to sound sort of turbulent, but over the course of the 9 years, Austin Barbell has been a professional gym. We've been in 6 facilities. So, and some of that is just the nature of the time. So we started off in a CrossFit gym, then we were in a soccer facility, which was amazing because we had access to turf and space and tons of parking and everything that goes along with that. And then COVID hit. So that soccer facility was primarily banking on after school programs for their kids. And they had a nice service where they would pick kids up in small buses and bring them to the facility after school program, take care of them, parents pick them up, they're ready to go. When there's no school, there's no after school program. And that's exactly what happened. Their business changed dramatically in one day. Nobody wants to do remote soccer coaching. So they had to take a bit of a hiatus during COVID. We were fortunate where we had the flexibility to loan equipment out and effectively, allow our athletes to keep training during that time. So I would almost call that like a time of, prosper. And I think a lot of weightlifting gyms that were just starting to bootstrap at that time also felt the same thing. It sort of brought people closer, even though everybody was a bit remote. And then, training got a bit more serious. People started aligning goals that were, inside their house instead of outside their house because of the travel restrictions and shelter in place and everything else that's like that. During COVID, we, because of that soccer facility, we decided to, venture out and find one of our own facilities. And we're here in South Austin. We did that for about 2 years and we grew pretty quickly. We didn't anticipate weightlifting being that, I don't know, attractive. But I think,
Cool.
yeah, I mean, I feel like what we do differently is we make weightlifting accessible to everybody. So we do have a lot of beginners. Probably 70% of our athletes are in that beginner 1 year or less. And we make it very easy and accessible for any athlete to come in. We have a structured onboarding program. We have a structured, first month of programming. And then we have a structured tiered system of classification for each of the athletes as they sort of ascend through the ranks of Austin Barbell. And, everything going from, beginner all the way to like a regional or nationally ranked athlete. And programming shifts and changes and the KPIs change and so forth. And in some cases, the coaches change too. That's where we're at today with the South location. And as time went on, and just like any other big metropolitan area where people are, Austin's like a destination city. Everybody wants to be here. We got tons of tech. People moved in right after COVID. And then we decided the complaints sort of overwhelmed us with the amount of people that wanted to train from North Austin and come to South Austin. Commute times can be 45 minutes to an hour. And I think it depends on who you talk to, because if you talk to somebody from Chicago, which is where I'm from, or LA, they're like, hey, I wish I had an hour commute. So, but in Austin, it's like what, 17 square miles. That's just, it's too much, and it's a detractor for individuals to come to training. So we decided the best move for the business and our athletes at the time was to open a second location. I could go into tremendous depth about why not to do that. But we're here to talk about technology and weightlifting, and not, the burden of running, two facilities and two businesses and a coaching staff and all other things. So
that's a different podcast.
That'll be the next one for sure.
Yeah. All good. Yeah, I know COVID was just such a wild time going through that. How long were you guys shut down for?
So Austin, or just Texas in general, we were sort of fortunate from like a business perspective that like it was very liberal in the sense that we were able to operate. I think there was maybe only a couple of weeks where we had to shelter in place, which gave us some time to plan, figure things out, realize that the end of the world wasn't coming. And, there were rules in place and there were laws, and it was up to the business owners to abide or not abide. There was very little enforcement. And to be fair, like Austin is just a business friendly, or Texas is a business friendly state. So there's lots of small businesses here. I've lived in Chicago for, most of my life. And I feel like running this sort of facility in that environment would be very difficult if you had to close down for a year or 2 years. So I really feel for my colleagues that had to do that in other states.
Yeah. I know up here in Canada, it was long periods of time.
Yeah.
There were like couple
sure.
month shutdowns, and I know it was luckily for me, we got to like rent out equipment from the facility we rent out of. But I can't imagine having spaces during that time.
Yeah, it was challenging. There are some benefits having a smaller, group of athletes to work with. And during that time, people prioritized, and, they tried to figure out if training meant something to them. I think the biggest issue was, and there was a time of uncertainty, like what's going to happen with USA Weightlifting? Like, what are we going to do? How are we going to compete? We participated in a few, I think we did like youth nationals, and that was a remote competition. It was, for all intents and purposes, it was a well-run online meet. I didn't think it was going to be possible. I didn't mind not traveling, but at the end of the day, it's like, the electricity that comes with competition and the pageantry and like, the effort that goes into it is significantly different. Having your name on a leaderboard or a ranking within USA Weightlifting and not having to physically go somewhere to earn that, I think was hard for some people.
I remember how many people had tech or Wi-Fi issues mid competition, and I was like, "Oh, this is going to be a problem."
For sure. And I guess like the one positive that came out of that, and I'm hypothesizing, the quarter kilo rule for singlet that came out of COVID. So that's the one benefit, is everybody gets that new little like quarter kilo allowance when they go to weigh in.
I remember my friend that trains up here was like, "Oh, we get a quarter kilo. I'm just gonna get the smallest singlet before they change the rule." So somebody in the States made like 50-gram singlets, and they were just like the old school singlets where it just covers the nipples, but you have to tape them.
I think if I had to make a choice between a singlet like that or just shaving my head, I would have gone with, I'm going to cut my hair to get that quarter kilo back. But yeah, I digress. It was good times. I strongly believe it built a better club for us being part of, COVID.
Yeah. So we'll kind of get into the classification system and that onboarding process that you kind of mentioned. So what does it kind of look like when they're coming out of those onboarding learn to lift sessions and then going into that classification system?
So we really had to take a step back, and we've thought through this millions of times. Like, every time we see a hiccup with a prospective athlete coming in and there's a learning curve, or we feel that there might have been a gap within our initial like PTs or on-ramp sessions, we basically re-engineer everything. And it is a well thought out scripted curriculum that goes over basically 3 hours. So when an athlete comes in, we assume, with or without any CrossFit experience or high school experience, that they have no lifting acumen. So we take them down to basics. The first session is focused on the snatch. We do we go top down. So our progression is built based on muscle snatch, power snatch with feet, and so forth. The progression itself is all done with a 5 kilo bar, plastic plates. Doesn't matter who you are. I mean, we want people to come in and to be able to like be successful in that first day. And I feel like that's really the most important thing. If you have an athlete come in that's just, they try to grind out some really questionable snatches, you're making them squat, they're doing uncomfortable things, they've never been overhead for the first time, chances are they're not going to come back. I mean, ego does play into it. I know we all say it doesn't, but nobody wants to feel like, the inexperienced individual in the corner of the gym, just sweating it out. We're all about trying to come up with the small W's, the wins at the end of the day. And we tell those athletes as they go through, like, you just did this. This is a major win. Let's note that. Let's put your name on we have a leaderboard or tracking board. So as soon as they come in, we're putting those numbers on the board so they have something to track against. And generally what you'll see is in that first month, because what they do in on-ramp versus what they're doing within, on day 31, they're going to be hitting some PRs, some more wins, collecting more W's. And it's essentially like, it's key to like sort of build that habit in order to get that momentum so they keep showing up to training. I mean, at the end of the day, like, people ask me like, what do you do? And I'm like, I'm a coach. But really what my job is really to promote the sport, grow the sport. And if I'm doing that, I'm coaching at the same time, and people are only going to stay with us if we're doing a quality job anyways. So that's really just, again, built into our process. That's really the first, 3 sessions. We've got snatch, we've got a clean session, we got a jerk session, and then we go over a fair amount of like gym safety. One of the things that I'm sure you see in all gyms, I hope it's just not mine, is that when a new athlete comes in, you always have the more experienced athlete or athletes that want to give them knowledge. And sometimes that's like, hey, don't walk in front of another athlete. Hey, don't load your bar like an idiot. But, we try to go over those things before those athletes come in for the first time, just so they understand, the etiquette on the floor, how to engage other athletes, how to walk around, how to navigate. Being in a weightlifting gym, with no machines to hide around is super intimidating. It's very scary for anybody to like experience. And, a lot of my athletes, they're regular people. Like, they want to be successful in weightlifting, but they also want to go home and, do their job, be a husband, be a wife, whatever. So these are like normal individuals. So I think the stigma that weightlifting gets is everybody thinks this is going to be like West Side weightlifting or West Side barbell, and there's going to be chalk flying and shirts getting torn off. And,
Wait, we doesn't have that? Oh, I think you got to start incorporating that.
There is chalk flying, but, at its core, we try to be like a really open, diversified, welcoming environment. And I think our reviews and our members, it speaks for itself.
Yeah, I found a really big difference, like going around different gyms. And then when I started my gym, was making it more individualized, or like separating those times where it's like you're doing the learn to lift outside of, because most clubs have club hours or team training.
Right.
And a lot of clubs will like bring athletes or new athletes into those team training hours and then do the learn to lift kind of like on the floor with everybody.
Right.
And I found it always so stressful for the athletes, and the coach's attention's always getting brought around. So like individualizing that, or even like in a group setting of like a learn to lift format, has been a lot better from what I've been feeling.
So when it comes to running our on-ramp sessions or our learn to lift sessions, they are primarily done on the fringe of when we do team training. We do want those athletes to see, either when they leave or when they're coming in, like what team training looks like. And we want them to understand that it's not intimidating. But there's a couple different paths that athletes can take after they finish on ramp. We do have a fair amount of athletes just continue doing personal training. They love training with a coach. They want that one-on-one attention. They want that custom program, and that's awesome. Like we're happy to to accommodate that. And then there's others that either due to cost or what they're trying to accomplish, they want to be part of that broader community and be part of the team training. Team training always doesn't always fit time wise into everybody's schedules. It is what it is.
Yeah, 100%. What are those different pathways or that classification system? How do they get filtered into that?
So, you mentioned individualized training. We do offer that, but the one thing to be aware of is like everybody wanted it, right? Everybody wants their own program. And I respect that. The issue is that if you're building 15, 20, 30, 100 different programs, the quality that's going into each program is not well thought out. It's typically cutting corners. They're going to be carbon copies or at least a variant of something else anyways. So instead of like just, saying that you're doing individualized training or custom programming, put a track in. And honestly, like athletes really enjoy working together in teams. So as an athlete comes in, they're a beginner, they're going through an on-ramp program. Then they move into like an intermediate or a regional or state plan. That plan will accommodate them up to American Open. And then after that, they're going to qualify for either nationals or finals or whatever. And then from there, they move into a national-based program. And the national-based program, for all intents and purposes, is basically an individualized program. It is very custom. The upside is that most of these athletes are preparing for the same events. So timeline-wise, as we're mapping out the year and creating our mesocycles and all those things, it's essentially, the timeline and trajectory is not going to change. So everybody's going through a volume phase together, everybody's going through a speed phase, everybody's going through hypertrophy and tapering and so forth. The ascension path, I find it's critical, especially on a larger club, unless you want to do, as a coach, 40, 50, 60 hours of programming. I've been there. It's super hard. I don't think I put out my best work when I'm working at that scale. And that's why we decided to sort of focus and, be a little bit more myopic with our teams. And if an athlete, is an outlier on any one of those teams, we'll move them into a custom plan. And, what comes to mind are, super heavyweights, athletes with previous injuries. There's a fair amount of males that are not quite, in a heavyweight class. They just can't take volume. So, we have to approach that as a super heavyweight, and they sort of fall into that category as well. Yeah, so you're either an outlier or you're on the team.
Yeah. So what would the differences in like the programming between those different levels kind of look like? Do you have like metrics or?
So initially when an athlete comes in and they're in that beginner phase, it's all about skill acquisition. So the metrics are, how much can we refine technique within the first 3 to 9 months? And obviously with being a competitive facility or organization, like we promote athletes going into a competition, and that's sort of like the first KPI, because you really learn a lot about an athlete when they compete for the first time. People that are joking around in the gym and they're super confident, you put them in a skin tight outfit in front of 3 referees and they get pretty scared pretty quick. But I think that's important, and it's necessary for them to compete in order to understand where their deficiencies are. So KPI wise, I would say we're just looking at numbers and acquisition of skill during that time frame. And we want the athlete to be comfortable. We want them to have fun. We're not trying to make this a environment where if you don't succeed, you're off the team. There's none of that. So, I mean, most of my athletes that are in that national, level, they've been with me for years. And I suspect they'll probably continue to be with us as long as they keep performing and we keep doing a great job for them.
How have you been able to have athletes that are more scared to do their first competition, kind of get them into that? So what I use like little club competitions, or I'll like do a teaching competition, and then I'll filter them up. What have you found to be the best route?
I find there's two types of individuals that are in that scared or nervous camp. You've got the ones that are absolutely petrified. They just want to close their eyes and huddle into a ball behind the barbell and hope it went well. And sometimes we let them close their eyes. And then there's the athletes that are nervous because they've never done it before, but you know they're going to crush it. So the way that we approach it is when they go through their peak, and it is a bit of a, even though these would be technically a train through meet, we are putting them through a bit of a taper so that they understand the process. We don't encourage anybody to go through a weight cut. I know that's everybody wants to get stronger, but they want to be smaller, and it doesn't work like that. So less things to think about makes it a better experience. And then the other things is we also set the bar pretty low. And I know that sounds terrible as a coach to set the bar low, but I want success. And I want basically 6 for 6 on that first meet. 6 for 6 basically means that they're learning something from it. If they just have, if they go 2 for 6 or they get 1 clean and 1 snatch and that's it, they're developing bad habits, at least in my opinion. So the first few meets are all about all whites, getting those green, boxes on the board and just having a great time, and let them work towards that second meet because they know they can do better. One thing that we put in place this past year, which I'm pretty proud of it, and I know it's a really small win, is we just made everybody on our national team journal. And, athletes will come to their coach typically when they're having an issue. It's never like, 2 weeks from the day they experienced it or whatever. And, they're always quick to express that training's hard. It's not going well. Their legs aren't working. They don't know why it's heavy. Us as coaches, we know why, because we're trying to institute stress on the athlete in order to get adaptation change. But for the athlete, they're going through a crisis. So we asked all those national athletes that we're preparing, instead of bringing in like a sports psych or some expert, let's just journal. Let's just write a small, note to ourselves before we get on the training floor. Let's write our program out so we're pulling away from the device or the phone, and we deliver all our programming on a mobile app just like everybody else. That mobile app can be Sheets or TrainerRook or whatever. And then after training, we want them again to compliment themselves, like what went well in training. And I know it's not always going to be that way, and they have to sort of almost talk themselves up to it. But I think it's important to, hear those compliments for yourself. Put that energy out there so that they can latch onto it and sort of keep chasing it. A fair amount of athletes out there they're just negative. Once you go down that path, it snowballs and it's very hard to pull that back. I'm super proud that all the athletes that we brought to nationals, we were able to prevent that from happening. And some of these athletes are the highest of performers. They're amazing athletes. They just don't see it from the perspective of the coaches. They see it from within themselves.
With the classification system, so you talked about having the journaling for the national level athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Are you planning on building something to get to that point, or continuing to elevate those expectations?
So we're going to continue to push that down in terms of to all of our athletes. I would like it where when an athlete comes in on day one, we're starting the habit. Here's your journal. This is what expectations are. And we keep it pretty loose. They write down their program and there's a smiley face or a star, and, just give yourself a grade. I think that's critical. So yeah, the plan is to push it down to all the athletes at some point. The way that we review those, we're basically just asking for a snapshot. I'm not collecting journals at the end of the week. I do ask that all the journals, the images from the week be sent Thursday before we start doing programming, which is over the weekend for the following week. Everything is planned out from an annual perspective, but as coaches, we're always looking to pivot or change or update. You never know how an athlete's going to respond. So, I use those journals as one of those indicators to understand where my athletes are. If I start seeing things like, hey, I'm not sleeping, my body hurts, I was sick last week, those are pretty strong indicators or KPIs that, they're under a lot of stress and you may need to do something.
I know something that I've talked with my athletes about is using GIFs or emojis to give me a snapshot into how their training went. And I find they're they're more likely to give you like a realistic, like, you got to interpret between the lines, but a
Sure.
realistic image of how they're actually feeling, versus when I would always get text, it would just be like everything's hard, and that would be it. Versus the
Absolutely.
GIF, it's like the whole building's on fire, where it's like everything's fine, and then you're like, okay, we're gonna talk about this.
For sure. For sure. What is this? What does the nuclear like mushroom cloud actually
Yeah,
mean? Um, yeah, I like that. I would definitely use that for some of my athletes, maybe the younger
yeah.
ones that are, have a hard time putting their feelings on a paper.
One of my athletes bought a whole bunch of stickers too, and so we just like hand them out or like let people pick to
Hmm.
put on their training journal. So it'd be like back and body hurts instead of
Yeah.
Bath and Body Works, and I was like, oh my god, what are we putting
I'm
on
always
here?
I'm always amazed, like, there's a lot of apps out there that do a really good job of, gaining athlete feedback and journaling and things like that, but they're always so cumbersome. Like they always take too much time, too many, taps or clicks to get like into, what you want to accomplish. And I just feel like pen and paper is just not going to go away. Like it's
Yeah,
just analog is sort of where it's at. I mean, let's face it, it's an analog sport for the most part.
and them having to write it down versus type it out. Like
Yeah.
I can't write without looking at the page,
Hmm.
but I can type without looking at it, and I can like do it kind of subconsciously. So I
Right.
found always writing it out made a much bigger difference because I always journaled as a athlete.
I feel like there's a tighter connection to the training if you write it out beforehand and then accomplish those small tasks in there versus like just, opening an app and, you know, oh, I didn't get the last 3 sets done. If you write it down, you're going to do it.
Yeah, 100%. Uh, and then with your systems, is there something specific that you're working at or working on developing other than skill acquisition in that first block between those two next ones?
Sure. So as part of so after an athlete goes through beginner programming, they'll move into an intermediate or regional level. When an athlete is training at that level, we're doing testing for the vast majority of the athlete population. And testing it's, for all intents and purposes, it's a very scaled down S&C approach. But we're doing IMTP, we're doing, counter movement jumps, we're on contact time, RSI scores, things along those lines. And unfortunately, because of the amount of athletes we have, we don't get to test all of them, but we get to test some of them. And we use those athletes as a representation based on where they are within our training structure. So if an athlete's in the intermediate tier and the vast majority of athletes test a certain way, we may use that as a way to sort of shape training, further down the road.
So what does that kind of look like using those different, well, force plates or VBT?
So force plates, we do have a pair. We got a pair of Vald force stacks. We're not using them as much as we would like, and the primary issue is that they just take too long to set up. And I know like the software has been built and it's made to like rotate a team pretty quickly. My go-to and my favorite thing to use for any athlete testing as of today is like OVR devices. They're reasonably inexpensive. The OVR velocity device, which is the LPT, the linear position transducer, they're fairly inexpensive. We've got basically these small cabinets in each of the gyms where the athletes can grab them on their own. There's like a checkout system similar to like what you'd have in a library. And then the athletes have the ability to sort of like self-test based on that. And I found that to be pretty effective. And even though we started doing this mainly with like the intermediate athletes, I do feel giving our beginners access to VBT would create probably a better training experience. And it's not necessarily the gamify portion of it. It's more along the lines of just getting more intent and better results within the first month. Now, you could probably walk on any training floor in any part of the country and look at the athletes there and just visually see as a coach that athlete squats like shit or they're just zoned out, right? You know, most people go through their classics, clean jerk snatch, whatever variations you give them. and then they get into squatting and then like they turn it off. And it's just like, there's no brain, there's no like cognitive thought. They're not like locked into training. They're just getting it done. And that's good that the volume is being, accomplished. But at the end of the day, it's like, if the athlete's not training with enough intent, like, and that intent can be like, the difference of like an 18%, push one way or another. I mean, then the sets aren't as effective as they could be.
100%. I know with my beginners, because I have a VBT unit, I don't use it as much as like a programming tool as much as like an education tool.
Right.
So much of like, okay, I need the bar to contact the hips, and then I need it to accelerate. Like I need that acceleration off of the hips, and it's like they don't get it. And then I use the velocity tracker, and I'll set them up on blocks or whatever, and I'll show them what it kind of looks like, and I'll take a video, and I'll have them try and do it how they normally do it, and then I'll have them do it with more of a hip contact and showing that peak velocity at the top and all of that. And then it starts to clue in and click of like, oh, it goes way faster. And it or you could look at like the bar path. It's like it doesn't stay completely straight out in front of me.
Right.
When I get it back into my hips, or they can see all of these things. Or then in squatting where it's like your 50% is equally as slow as your 80%. So it's like, I need these to move way faster so we're not fatigued, and we can develop that power and that force output as we increase the weight. And then as I get to those more experienced athletes, it's like starting to use that for velocity loss or gamifying training and stuff like that.
Yeah, we're taking a similar approach. I think with the beginners, it just gives them an insight into what training autonomy can be. So there's, we've got sessions of 20 athletes or more with 1 to 2 coaches on the floor. And there's no way for a coach to, be in your ear telling you like, go faster, drive quicker, whatever. There's just not enough coaches on the floor to cue the athletes. So I feel like adding this into training, like gives the athlete ownership of their training versus just like, hey, was that good? Can I keep going more? Can I, whatever. So.
Yeah, I remember SoCal when they first moved, into that space. They organized it so it was like the coaches could stay on the weightlifting area, and then the pulls and the squats could be done kind of in that separate area. And like you're saying, where it's like you can use this VBT device or these force plates, whatever you're kind of using, and use that over there where it's like you can teach them that autonomy. I think that's a really good idea.
I think, it is a humble sport. It's mostly analog, except for the digital components we bring into it. But I think now in weightlifting, like the technology is getting so cost effective and so accessible. I mean, there's apps for your phone. There's Metric, which is a VBT, it uses your camera and so forth. And I'm sure it works great. But even like a basic OVR device, like you're talking $250. You can goes in your bag. It's not bad for what it is. It's fairly accurate, works, powers on, battery lasts. I mean, there's no reason as a weightlifter or a coach to sort of like bite into these new technologies. And I think if you're not, I mean, you're probably not looking at, coaches need to look at athletes through a different lens. And I think like coaches in general, we always go back to that dogmatic approach of like, I know the athlete should be quicker here. I know this. And it's always based on like previous coaching input from, your coach or another athlete or so forth. But I'm a data guy. Like I love data and I want to see it and I want to show it to somebody and I want them to react to it. And I feel with like all this data in like all these devices that are super inexpensive, there's no reason to not be a part of this. It's like, this is a bit of like a inflection point in weightlifting. 10 years ago, there was USA Weightlifting had a an LPT device, maybe a couple of smaller gyms, but now it's mainstream. Anybody can have it. You can now talk to athletes and be like, oh, well, what's your velocity loss on your top sets, and they'll understand what that means. And those are conversations we weren't having with athletes even 3 or 4 years ago. So, the whole force velocity profile and looking at athletes through that lens, that's a very real thing. And it's a common conversation that we have with athletes nowadays.
And it's much easier to actually analyze that data or confirm that our
Hmm.
programming is doing the correct thing. Whereas, no, I need this speed output or this force characteristic to actually improve, and it's like, okay, we're gonna do what I think works, or what, like you were saying, what we've used in the past, and hope,
Right.
and we'll expect. And then it's like, okay, well, how did you test to see if that actually improved? And they're like, oh, well, the went up, or I did two
Right.
extra reps on my 85%. And it's like, well, did that actually carry over to like improving speed qualities and being able
Sure.
to actually produce more force at what is more specific of the snatch and clean and jerk versus the back squat?
Right. Exactly.
Relating to that, like, what are some of the metrics that you're focusing on using either the VBT or the force plates?
So with VBT, we're basically looking at average or mean power output. We're looking at mean velocity. We're looking at velocity loss, which OVR doesn't necessarily do too well, at least not like when you're looking at it from like a spreadsheet. But the data is raw, so you can analyze it any way you want. So we'll look at data, we'll look at velocity loss in top sets. Another thing that we're trying to push out to our athletes and get them more accustomed to is doing readiness with it. So I just had this conversation with an athlete yesterday. I told her every day when you come in, you're going to put 60 kilos on the bar and we're going to see how fast we can move it. And we just want to gauge that over the course of the next 3 to 4 weeks and just see if there's any, fluctuation before they come in to see how it correlates to training. And if it did correlate where, she's getting slower or faster or whatnot, I mean, it would be an input to change training so that we can, make sure she's ready to perform when she needs to perform.
Gotcha. And with the power and the velocities, how are you? Or are you picking specific weights or specific
So
percentages? Are you
the
doing
way
all the
we
sets?
the way we program the way we program using VBT, it's generally going to be on a squat or a pull, typically on a squat. It's it's easy enough for an athlete to, connect a device and do it. I'm not using LPT devices on snatch or clean and jerk. I don't want to add that obstacle to training right now. We're looking at some accelerometers that will do that, but that'll be in the future. But right now, we're basically just programming ranges of velocity that they need to achieve, and then they decide what weight needs to be there, and that's where they're seeing the progress. So if they see like, oh, I was able to move, what could be my 80% at zero point 0.6 meters per second, I can go up or down, and it just adds a little bit more auto regulation to training. And for those athletes that are, and I spoke a little bit about like those male athletes that they're not quite super heavyweights, but they definitely have the attributes of it. Um, those are the individuals that typically have like the knee issues and they're achy. And I find that VBT or just that auto regulation really makes a huge change for them. Now they're in control of their programming and to some degree, variables within it, and allows them to basically make sure they're not pushing too hard or push hard when they feel great.
Yeah, I it's such a crazy thing not using the VBT devices now that you've used them, where it's like you see so much better output and so much less aches and pains.
For sure.
So I used to use it a whole lot, and then because I only had one and my club was getting a little bit busier, I kind of put it away because I was like, I didn't want to pick and choose who to use it
Hmm.
with, and have to spend all that time like setting it up. But I'm ordering another couple sets to then start using it full time. It's like, okay, for our like accumulation or general preparation blocks,
Right.
in that block, it's like we can do AMRAP sets with just a velocity loss cutoff, and it's like try
Hmm.
and build where it's like, okay, what's our goal for this block? Build up more work capacity, more total volume. It's like we can write that out of like do a top triple and then two AMRAP sets at minus 20% with whatever velocity loss, 15%, 20% velocity loss, and then just try and build up those AMRAP sets. And then we can see, as long as it's like, okay, we went from 3 sets of 6 to 3 sets of 10, 12, or 12, 10, and 8 or something like that. And then we're like,
Hmm.
okay, we definitely did exactly what we were working on, and now we can build on that.
Yeah. So you're using the OVR device or
I have a flex unit. and then I'm
Okay.
looking at getting some output, or I'm getting some output units. So the
Hmm.
output, I work with some gymnastics clubs, so
Okay.
I can do the jump testing, and they just put it on their foot, so it makes it a little bit easier.
Yeah.
Versus force plates, it's like you have to wait for the body weight to get calculated. I don't really
Hmm.
want the gymnastics girls to see the body weight and all that kind of stuff. Versus these output units are a little bit faster, easier. They can do VBT, and they have a full dashboard that you can do range of motion assessments with as well.
Yeah. The output sports, their units are pretty nice. We're looking at them and one other, I guess one of their competitors as well.
Yeah. Because I had a rep one, and I was just always nervous I was going to drop something on it
Mm.
every time. So then I got a flex unit, 'cause then I was like, okay, there's nothing I'm going to worry about.
Other than the cost.
This six, well, then I got to import it into Canada, and it's another $100.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
that's what I'm saying. You guys are lucky. Everything up here costs more money. Um, I know you're looking at starting more remote and individualized coaching.
Hmm.
What does that kind of look like, trying to onboard them into that system that you have?
So we've already got a small population of like remote athletes that have been with us for a period of time, but we always think like, how can we make this better? And what would we do differently if we were to take on more? So we generally just shied away from remote programming because I think we excel at like in gym. We're very good at bringing beginners in, turning, standard regular people into weightlifters, which is what every coach wants to do. But when it comes to remote training, the hardest part is doing any sort of data collection. You try to do some like, within WhatsApp or, like through videos, draw lines, whatever. And that's fine. You can see some, changes in speed and, you can give advice, but it's always in post. It's never like during training. So athletes aren't getting those cues as quickly. So how do you get around that? And I feel like how you get around that is by building more autonomy, even more than what a remote athlete would normally have. And the only way to do that is to educate the athlete. And you're not going to be able to send them a book and say, read this and let's go train. But you can give them the tools and the levers to pull within training so that they become their barbell IQ effectively goes up. So we did consider sending OVR devices to a couple of our athletes. They're simple enough and, they're not, we can get a deposit and sort of like cover that cost. We're also looking at, you mentioned Output Sports. Output Sports is a predominant player. They've got that dashboard. Data collection's pretty easy because it's all, cloud based. But that in my opinion is the right way to do remote programming or remote coaching, is to have enough data where you can make those decisions based on, whatever the athlete's doing, either from a movement assessment or looking at, load velocity profile, ground contact time, RSI score. These are all things that can, sort of change or move the needle within programming for an athlete. Um, we will probably start doing something along those lines in the next 30 to 60 days. I think with remote training, I think those sort of technologies can really, sort of change the game overall.
And so, with that being more of the programming aspect of like that barbell or weightlifting IQ, how are you teaching them the technical characteristics, or developing that, or the mental characteristics
So the technical characteristics of training or using the device
of training?
of training. So that's always done through basically video review. We try to be as real time or as quickly as possible. We don't have any restrictions like, hey, if you send me a video today, I'm not going to get to it until Friday. So it's an ongoing process. I don't think it's any different than what most coaches are doing. They're probably sitting down, they're going through a bunch of videos, they're batching them out as quickly as possible. Um, what they're missing though is the data. And, when an athlete's remote, they're basically just pixels on a screen. And, those pixels should have KPIs.
Yep, 100%. One of the things that I started doing, similar to like that journaling, is I organize it into a what, why, how format. So it's like, what are we working on? Like, what's happening in the day, and what are we working on? Then why is, uh, essentially, because social media, there's so much information out there. I had to start adding this section in to be like, why are you doing this? Is this because some influencer is like, oh, you got to do this on your snatch, and then all of a sudden you start working on it, or
Right.
something along that? And then the how is like, how did it go? What kind of, or how did the cues feel? How did they generally go? And so I'll have them format that into, I use Coach now. So it's like, what, working on sweeping the bar back to the hip above the knee. And it's like, why? Well, you told me to. I'm like, sweet, why are we doing that? And then they can kind of confirm what their thoughts are and what my
Mhm.
thoughts are of the explanation. Because a lot of the time it's like with my remote athletes, I would give them cues and they wouldn't respond or do anything. And then a couple days later, they'd come into training and I'd be like, they would just be like, I don't know what that meant. And I was like, well, this is what we need to kind of work on, is like having this two-way feedback loop so that
Right.
I give you the information, you then reflect on that information and tell me why or what or how it's working. And then we can kind of continue rolling that ball moving forward. And then the how is really important, of like, I had somebody walk in front of me, or I didn't sleep at all last night, and I was just really struggling to focus on my cues or whatever that kind of looks like. And then it gives me an insight of like, oh, maybe I giving them more feedback isn't really necessary because they know what they're trying to work on. They just didn't have the availability or energy to be able to
Right.
actually put into that. And I found that that format gave a lot more insight, but it takes a lot more time and effort for the athletes. So it's like that balancing of like, you have to do all of this work on top of all of your training is something that can be hard to convince or sell on athletes, is what I found.
You always get those athletes within the first month, they've bought their fourth pair of shoes and, they're trying to learn everything they can in the, with the smallest bite-sized portions of information, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. I just basically, we have this conversation often with most athletes, this is a marathon and, some people improve at different, rates. That's totally normal, based on, what their background was beforehand. But, at the end of the day, it's like you just have to sort of embrace the process and what the coach and club is trying to accomplish. So that's what you're buying into, is really the experience of the coach, not necessarily that of Instagram.
Yep. Wait, are we not supposed to buy 4 pairs of shoes? Is that what you're saying? We're not supposed to buy all of the new tier shoes?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, it basically just, it shows buy-in from the athlete. I love when athletes, like, they go all in on shoes and apparel and all the things that go around, making you a weightlifter. Um, but sometimes if they just focus a little bit more on the basics, or the specifics of the sport rather than, the color of the shoe, it could change things.
100%. Going into like more philosophy, how do you kind of balance your coaching instinct or feel and then using this data?
So what I do often is, specifically with VBT, as I'm watching an athlete and when they're doing any sort of testing or using the VBT devices on their own, I'll sort of, and I think most coaches probably do this. I'll look at a lift and I'll be like, oh, point, 0.6 meters per second. And then you see that what's on the screen and you're like, okay, 0.58. I'm like, I'm pretty close. So I'm always looking to develop my eye to basically be as good as something that could measure, with VBT or velocity. Um, I don't think I'll ever, be as good as something that's engineered to do one purpose, but that data will then get harvested and we'll use that as a way to, shift training for, like, if an athlete is deficient. Here's a good, I guess, case in point. Have you ever trained a power lifter?
I have not.
So power lifters are interesting because, they're super strong. Egos are huge in most cases. But we had an athlete come in a couple years ago and, he had like a 280 kilo squat and it was awesome. We didn't have any sort of VBT devices at the time. The issue was, as you'd imagine, there was no speed. There was very little power output. And it was really difficult to demonstrate to him why he couldn't do basic movements like a power snatch at 40 kilos or other things like that. And really it goes back to, what qualities was he working on when he started training? And it was basically just raw output, just absolute strength. And once an athlete understands that there's a power band and we're trying to focus on these individual qualities for every athlete, we can then shift training to be more specific. For instance, if that athlete can squat 280 kilos, but, he can't jump more than 6 inches, we may shift things to, be more plyometric based or, lighter sets. It depends on where we're working.
Yeah. And are you ever ignoring kind of that data because of what your kind of coaching field is telling you?
I might retest. I mean, there's always, that bad day, where the athlete comes in and you just expected more out of them. I would definitely retest an athlete, but if the results are conclusive, and we need to focus on something specific and they're serious about being a weightlifter and competing and, participating in the sport, we'll shift programming. I mean, that would be an outlier, in my opinion, that would justify like, hey, like we need to work on this stuff because you lack it. Because the last 10 years of your life, you moved super slow, and now that's you only know type 1, fibers. We need to recruit more type 2 fibers in order to like build speed. So the training is going to change dramatically.
I remember this one athlete I had was squatting at like 0.22, and I was like, oh, she's for sure done. Like that's probably it. And then she kept going up another like 7% off of like 130. And I was like, how did this keep happening? Her end was, I think, 0.14. And I was like, I didn't think it got that slow on a squat. But that is impressive. But then her 70% was also 0.35. And I was
Right.
like, okay, all right, we gotta chip on this.
It's interesting when we do test athletes to see. We might have an athlete come in that's relatively new to the sport. Maybe they did some, compound lifts or, they tried powerlifting, and you test them either on the Vault Force X or, with an OVR device, and the power output is like huge. Like you're like, you didn't expect that from that athlete. And that may also shift things in a different direction where, okay, like this athlete's not very strong, but they've got a ton of, accelerative power and they're able to, they should be able to accomplish more. Now, there's never going to be a correlation to, this athlete can move this bar at this speed to like what they should be lifting. So if you're saying like, okay, this athlete creates this much power doesn't, there's no like this is X, this is the result of it. It's all going to come down to, individual testing with the athlete actually trying to put that load on the bar. I think one of the biggest changes that we've seen, and we sort of touched on this before by giving athletes the ability to do auto-regulation, is that we don't need to push as hard in training. So because of EBT and the way the athletes are squatting and pulling, they're more or less able to, not fatigue themselves as much. So they don't see this accumulation of, their CNS failing at the end of a training cycle.
Yeah. And they feel better day to day, and they're making more progress. And you're like, every time I used it, I was like, this is suspicious. Like, why? Like, this is different than what every coach I've ever talked to has taught me. Where it's
Right.
like you got to essentially bag skate them in that first block. And you're like, all right, let's do it. And then they're just tired forever. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't actually end with the best result. That ends with a maybe positive result, but
Right.
not the best result.
For sure. For sure. I strongly feel that if an athlete is, moving into that, 0.4 meters per second, they're grinding so hard that they're going to need probably, a week or more before they can come back again. So we try to, now we have an indicator to say, hey, don't rev your engine so high. Let's keep it down a little bit.
Sweet. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I just got a quick end question here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, what is one principle that you think every coach should start to work towards or systematize?
So I sort of said this earlier. I definitely think coaches need to start looking through the lens of velocity. So we look at volume and we look at intensity, and those are really the only two levers that we use, or most coaches for that matter. And I think if you add that third component into it, and you look at the amount of like acceleration and speed and power output, now that that data is like accessible and easy to harvest, there's no reason to not, latch onto that. I think most coaches would be surprised how easy and how quickly they can integrate it into their programming, and it can
Sweet.
be done at scale.
Yeah, it's starting to get way cheaper. I know the output units are like 500, but those OVR at what, 250?
They run sales between 225 and 275. Their support is phenomenal. It's a great company. I've had no issues with them, and it's just, it exports out into a CSV or a spreadsheet. So it's just raw data. That's what we love as coaches. We just want data.
Sweet. Well, thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Weight of Coaching. If you got something out of this conversation, please share it with a coach or athlete who you think might benefit. You can follow Rob. I'll let you do your outro.
Sure. Coach Rob Ronan, you can find me on Instagram, or Austin Barbell, also on Instagram, or hit us up on, www.austinbarbell.com.
And you can follow me at Method Barbell on Instagram. And thank you.